September 1945. Tokyo is no longer a city of wood and paper, but a jagged, blackened skeleton of charcoal stretching toward a pale, indifferent horizon. The air carries a heavy, cloying scent, a mixture of wet ash, stagnant canal water, and the scorched metallic tang of a civilization reduced to its base elements. Beneath the low, gray clouds, the only sound is the rhythmic, mechanical crunch of gravel under the heavy tires of American Studebaker trucks. These six-wheeled leviathans rumble through the district of Ueno, their olive-drab paint appearing alien against the monochrome wasteland of the imperial capital. From the shadows of makeshift shacks constructed from rusted corrugated iron, hollow-eyed survivors watch the convoy pass. They do not look with rage, but with a vacant, terrifying stillness. For the people of Tokyo, the war did not end with a bang, but with a paralyzing realization of their own mortality. The soldiers in the trucks, young men from places like Iowa and Pennsylvania, sit atop crates of rations and equipment, their faces obscured by the dust of the ruins. They carry with them the weight of a victorious empire, yet they enter a landscape that feels more like a graveyard than a prize of war. The silence of the Japanese civilians is a physical weight, a manifestation of the kaidatsu, the state of total exhaustion and despair that followed the emperor's surrender broadcast. In this vacuum of spirit, the Japanese expected the victors to arrive with the bayonet and the torch, mirroring the grim prophecies of their own wartime propaganda. They anticipated the blue-eyed devils to be agents of systematic retribution, prepared to harvest what little life remained in the scorched earth. Instead, the trucks begin to slow, coming to a halt in a cleared square where a temple once stood. The dust settles, revealing not a firing squad, but a group of specialists from the Civil Information and Education section. They begin to unload strange, oversized wooden trunks and folded canvases. To the watching orphans and the elderly women clutching threadbare kimonos, the movements of the Americans are incomprehensible. There is a terrifying efficiency to their labor, a stark contrast to the slow, lethargic movements of a starving population. Among the gear, a young corporal reaches into a pocket and pulls out a small, translucent white cube. He holds it up to the sun, the light refracting through the refined crystals of pure sugar. In a city where the taste of sweetness has been a forgotten memory for years, the object is more than food. It is a shimmering symbol of a world that possesses a surplus of joy. The soldier tosses the sugar cube to a young boy standing near the ruins. The child catches it, staring at the small, perfect geometric shape with a mixture of suspicion and awe. This single moment of material abundance, the casual gift of something so rare, serves as the quiet prologue to a psychological revolution that is about to unfold on a makeshift stage. To understand why a simple puppet show carried the weight of a geopolitical shift, one must look at the psychological landscape of Japan in the autumn of 1945. The nation was in the grip of the kaidatsu condition, a state of profound mental collapse where the civilian population, stripped of their divinity and their empire, existed in a spiritual void. 4 years, the militarist government had fueled a narrative of the 100-Year War, promising that the spirit of the Yamato race would prevail over the material decadence of the West. When the surrender was announced, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was the shattering of a shared reality. The general headquarters of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, led by Douglas MacArthur, understood that a starving, broken population could easily turn toward the radical ideologies of the left or descend into permanent anarchy. Physical reconstruction was necessary, but the reconstruction of the Japanese mind was the true priority. This necessitated the creation of the Civil Information and Education section, a specialized unit tasked with the delicate mission of re-education. Their goal was to introduce concepts of individual liberty, women's suffrage, and democratic governance to a people who had only known the vertical hierarchy of the imperial system. Traditional methods of propaganda, posters, radio broadcasts, and dry pamphlets, were deemed insufficient for a population that had grown cynical of state-sponsored messaging. The Americans needed a medium that was disarming, accessible, and culturally resonant. They looked to the history of Japanese street theater and found their answer in the traveling performance. The decision to use puppets was a calculated stroke of psychological genius. In Japanese culture, the tradition of bunraku and traveling doll theater was deeply embedded in the rural and urban consciousness. By using puppets, the occupation forces could circumvent the immediate visceral fear that a physical American soldier might provoke. A puppet could say things a conqueror could not. It could mock the former military regime, celebrate the simple joys of a free society, and present the American way not as a set of cold laws, but as a vibrant, colorful, and human experience. As the trucks fanned out into the prefectures beyond Tokyo, carrying these wooden actors, they were moving into a territory where the civilian population remained deeply suspicious. These people had been told for a decade that Americans were monsters who would find sport in their suffering. The stage was being set for a confrontation between the dark myths of wartime propaganda and the surreal, brightly colored reality of the American puppet. This was the beginning of the information war in the ruins, where the prize was the future of a decimated generation. Every crate unloaded, every curtain hung, and every sugar cube distributed was a tactical move in a campaign to prove that the victors brought not just peace, but a standard of living and a degree of freedom that was previously unimaginable in the shadow of the throne. In the rural prefectures, far from the charred remains of the capital, the arrival of the American units was met with a primitive, bone-deep terror. For years, the villagers of the countryside had been fed a diet of horrific imagery by the taco, the special hire police. They expected the Americans to be giants with horns, savage beasts who would bayonet infants and enslave the elderly. In their pockets, many fathers carried small, sharpened bamboo spears or rusted kitchen knives, prepared for a final desperate act of domestic defense before committing ritual suicide. They stood in the village squares with their heads bowed, shoulders hunched against the expected blow of a conqueror's boot. This was the emotional baseline of the Japanese civilian, a state of high-tensile dread, masked by a facade of stoic obedience. They clutched their meager rations, lumps of sawdust bread made from rice husks and ground acorns, believing this would be their final meal before the end of their world. The contrast between this expectation and the unfolding reality was a psychological shockwave. Instead of the expected violence, the villagers witnessed a performance of industrial and material confidence. The American GIs did not move like soldiers on a campaign of vengeance. They moved like workmen on a holiday. They whistled tunes that sounded jagged and energetic to the Japanese ear, their movements loose and informal. The local headman looked on in bewilderment as the invaders ignored the strategic high ground and instead focused on the logistics of the theater. The Americans were not setting up machine gun nests. They were stringing up colorful banners and testing audio equipment that projected voices with a clarity that seemed supernatural. The sensory gap was insurmountable. The Japanese villagers, thinned by years of malnutrition, watched as the Americans drank from tins of chilled juice and tossed the empty steel containers into the trash with a casualness that suggested an infinite supply. To a people who had spent the war recycling every scrap of metal and rationing every grain of salt, this display of waste was more terrifying than a gun. It signaled a level of power that the Japanese military had never even attempted to describe. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the square, the tension reached a breaking point. The curtain of the mobile stage twitched. The villagers tightened their grip on their children, expecting the puppets to be tools of mockery or symbols of their own humiliation. They prepared themselves for the worst, unaware that the Americans were about to strike not at their bodies, but at the very foundations of their indoctrinated sorrow. The laughter, when it finally came, would be the first crack in the armor of the old world. Amidst the gray, dust-choked reality of the village square, the recurring presence of the symbolic object began to alter the atmospheric pressure of the gathering. It was the white sugar cube, a small, clinical, and perfectly manufactured concentrate of energy. To the American soldiers, it was a staple of their K-rations, a minor luxury often traded or ignored. To the Japanese civilian, it was a relic of a lost world. Before the war had spiraled into total collapse, sugar had been a treat reserved for festivals and New Year celebrations. By 1944, it had vanished entirely from the civilian supply chain, replaced by bitter substitutes and the hollow ache of malnutrition. Now, these cubes appeared in the hands of the occupation forces with a frequency that suggested an inexhaustible reservoir. They were handed out with a casual flick of the wrist, a gesture that bypassed the formal hierarchies of the village and spoke directly to the primal needs of the children. The sugar cube was more than a nutrient. It was a physical manifestation of American democracy and industrial might. While the Japanese state had demanded the sacrifice of every sweetness for the sake of the front, the American system arrived with sweetness to spare. As the children placed the cubes on their tongues, the sudden, overwhelming rush of glucose triggered a sensory shock. The gritty, crystalline texture and the pure, unadulterated flavor represented a standard of living that the wartime propaganda had claimed was a sign of Western decadence. Yet, in the mouth of a starving child, it felt like the first breath of life after a long period of suffocation. The parents watched this exchange with a mix of terror and envy. They saw the enemy using sweetness as a bridge, a tactic that was far more effective than any threat of force. This small, white square of refined cane sugar became the silent protagonist of the occupation. It represented a society that could afford to be generous because it was fundamentally whole. It symbolized a nation that prioritized the contentment of the individual over the glory of the state. As the crowd waited for the puppets to appear, the lingering taste of the sugar in the mouths of the young served as a chemical precursor to the emotional transition that was coming. The fear that had paralyzed the village began to soften at the edges, replaced by a confused, aching curiosity. If the Americans had the power to produce such perfection in a single cube, and the will to give it away, then perhaps everything the people had been told about the demons was a lie. The sugar cube was the first lesson in a new curriculum of freedom, a tiny, edible monument to the material abundance that underpinned the democratic ideal. It prepared the ground for the puppets, ensuring that when the performance began, the audience would be tasting the first sweetness of peace while they watched the last vestiges of their wartime reality be dismantled on the stage. The heavy velvet curtain of the mobile stage suddenly jerks upward, revealing the first of the American puppets. The figures are garish, with oversized noses, bright blue eyes, and exaggerated Western features that would have looked monstrous in a propaganda poster. But here, under the soft afternoon light of a rural square, they move with a frantic, comical energy. The first puppet is a caricature of a bumbling American GI, struggling to open a massive can of peaches with a bayonet, his wooden limbs flailing in a rhythmic dance of incompetence. For a long, agonizing moment, the Japanese audience remains frozen. The silence is thick with the residue of a decade of indoctrination, the belief that any interaction with the enemy was a betrayal. Then a single high-pitched giggle erupts from a small boy in the front row, his mouth still stained with the white residue of a sugar cube. It is the catalyst. Within seconds, the tension snaps. The laughter that follows is not a polite chuckle, but a desperate, guttural release of air. The adults, who had been standing with their backs rigid and their eyes downcast, begin to double over. They laugh at the absurdity of the movements, at the high-pitched, squeaky Japanese voices provided by the American operators, and at the sheer, surreal fact of their own survival. To these civilians, who had been taught that the Americans were soulless killing machines, the sight of the enemy, mocking their own clumsiness on a stage, was a cognitive dissonance too great to process through anything but mirth. The puppets move with a kinetic freedom that the Japanese people had been denied. They are loud, they are messy, and they are profoundly human. The performance utilizes slapstick humor to dismantle the image of the invincible warrior. The audience watches as the puppets stumble, fall, and engage in ridiculous arguments over trivial things like lost socks or cold coffee. This was a deliberate choice by the CINE planners. to show that the Americans were not gods or demons, but fallible, relatable men who valued humor over stoicism. As the puppets dance across the stage, the recurring symbolism of abundance reappears. One puppet pulls a string of endless sausages from a tiny box, while another tosses handfuls of wooden sugar cubes into a miniature crowd. The Japanese civilians find the spectacle ridiculous, their laughter fueled by the sheer impossibility of such plenty. They laugh because the alternative is to acknowledge the total bankruptcy of their own wartime sacrifices. In this moment of shared comedy, the terrifying other is replaced by a wooden toy, and the grim duty of the holy war is replaced by the simple, subversive act of being entertained. The square is transformed from a site of potential execution into a theater of the absurd, where the first bricks of a new, democratic identity are laid down not with a hammer, but with a punchline. For the first time in a generation, the people of the prefecture are not a collective unit of the emperor. They are individuals, reacting with spontaneous, uncoordinated joy to the sight of a bumbling wooden soldier. The logistical reality of this operation was as vast as the industrial machine that birthed it. While the civilians saw only a single stage, behind the curtain lay a sophisticated apparatus of the civil information and education section. These were not merely random acts of charity. They were part of a coordinated truth campaign designed to fill the intellectual vacuum left by the fallen regime. The units traveled in specially equipped trucks, carrying portable generators that hummed with a steady, reassuring drone, a sound of progress that contrasted with the dead silence of the ruined Japanese power grid. Each troop was composed of linguists, puppeteers, and social psychologists who monitored the crowd's reactions with clinical precision. They recorded the numbers of attendees, noting that in some regions, over 80% of the local population would emerge from the hills to witness the spectacle. The scripts were carefully translated to ensure that the humor remained accessible while subtly embedding democratic values. The puppets didn't just tell jokes, they acted out scenarios involving local elections, the rights of the laborer, and the equality of the sexes. In many villages, the puppet democracy was the first time women had been encouraged to stand in the front of a public gathering rather than the shadows. The sheer volume of material used in these tours was staggering. Thousands of miles covered on roads that were often little more than mud tracks, and millions of leaflets distributed that echoed the themes of the plays. Each performance was preceded by a display of the recurring symbol, the distribution of refined sugar, chocolate, and white flour. The Americans were moving nearly 4 million tons of food into the country to prevent mass starvation, and the puppet shows served as the cultural face of this massive relief effort. One particular account from a rural outpost described a crowd of 3,000 civilians standing in a freezing autumn rain, refusing to move until the puppets had finished their routine. The data gathered by the CINE units showed a remarkable trend. Where the puppets went, the incidence of resistance or hostility toward occupation forces dropped to near zero. The American puppet was achieving what 1,000 bayonets could not. It was proving that the New World was not only powerful but inherently benevolent. The records of these shows reveal a population that was moving from a state of kaiadatsu into a state of active, if confused, engagement. The civilians were no longer just survivors, they were an audience. And as an audience, they were beginning to internalize the narrative that their former leaders had lied about the nature of the enemy. The laughter was the bridge, but the structural integrity of that bridge was maintained by the cold, hard facts of American logistics and the undeniable sweetness of the sugar that continued to flow from the trucks into the hands of the conquered. As the sun began to slip beneath the jagged horizon of the burnt-out district, the tempo of the performance underwent a subtle, masterful shift. The slapstick movements of the bumbling American soldier puppet slowed, his frantic flailing replaced by a heavy, deliberate gait. The bright, brassy music that had accompanied the laughter faded into a single, melancholic woodwind melody that drifted like smoke through the silent crowd. The puppet sat down on a miniature wooden crate, his painted blue eyes staring into a small, flickering stage light that mimicked a lonely campfire. Beside him, a second puppet appeared, a Japanese mother in a simple, tattered kimono, her wooden head bowed in a posture of universal grief. There was no dialogue, only the shared language of movement. The American puppet reached into his pack and pulled out a tiny, sparkling replica of a sugar cube. He did not toss it with the bravado of the earlier scenes. Instead, he placed it gently on the ground between them. The Japanese mother puppet reached out, her hand trembling on its strings, and touched the object before looking up at the enemy who had shared his sweetness. In that silence, the laughter that had filled the square only moments ago died away, replaced by a tension so sharp it felt like a physical edge. The civilians watching from the ruins were no longer seeing a caricature of their conquerors. They were seeing a reflection of their own fractured lives. His transition was the emotional core of the CINE's strategy, to move the audience from the safety of mockery to the vulnerability of shared sorrow. The villagers realized that the puppet on the stage was mourning his own brothers lost in the Pacific, just as they were mourning the husbands and sons who would never return from the jungles of Burma or the frozen plains of Manchuria. The demon was revealed to be a man of sorrows, and the enemy was revealed to possess a heart capable of both abundance and empathy. The recurring symbol of the sugar cube transformed in this light. It was no longer just a display of industrial wealth, but a token of peace offered from one grieving soul to another. The atmosphere in the square grew heavy with a collective realization that had been suppressed for years. The war had been a tragedy of mutual destruction, fueled by the lies of those who claimed that one race was divine and the other subhuman. As the two puppets bowed to each other in the fading light, the emotional dam began to leak. The civilians, who had been taught that tears were a sign of weakness and a betrayal of the national spirit, felt the first stinging heat of a grief that was about to become a deluge. The play had moved beyond entertainment. It had become a funeral rite for the old world. The transformation within the square was not merely emotional, but ideological. As the puppet performance continued, the civilians were forced to confront a reality that shattered the foundation of their previous existence. For a decade, the Japanese people had been indoctrinated with the state Shinto ideology, which dictated that their supreme purpose was to serve as a cog in the imperial war machine. They were told that Western democracy was a corrosive disease, a system of chaotic selfishness that would lead to the ruin of the soul. Yet, standing in the cold mud of their own defeat, they looked at the stage and saw a different truth. The American puppets were not celebrating the destruction of Japan. They were celebrating the resilience of the human spirit. They were depicting a world where an individual's happiness was a valid pursuit, and where the enemy could offer a hand in friendship without demanding a soul in return. This shift in perception was facilitated by the overwhelming material evidence of American success. The recurring presence of the sugar cube became a physical argument against the old regime. If the Japanese leadership had been truly divine, the civilians reasoned, why had they led the nation into a famine that stripped the sweetness from the mouths of children? If the Americans were truly demons, why did they arrive with trucks full of medicine, grain, and refined sugar? The information war was being won not through complex philosophy, but through the undeniable contrast between the bitter poverty of the imperial past and the sugary promise of the democratic future. The civilians began to understand that the decadence they had been warned about was, in fact, a surplus of care, a society that had grown so powerful it could afford to be merciful. The transformation was visible in the posture of the crowd. The rigid, fearful stances began to soften as the people leaned toward the stage. They were no longer a mass of subjects performing a duty. They were becoming a community of individuals undergoing a shared awakening. They watched as the puppets enacted the simple freedoms of a new constitution: voting, speaking, and learning. In these wooden figures, the Japanese saw a version of themselves that was no longer tethered to the whims of a military elite. They realized that the puppet strings of the occupation were actually pulling them toward a liberation they had never dared to imagine. The ideological armor of the wartime years was falling away, piece by piece, as the audience accepted the possibility that their salvation lay in the hands of the very people they had been ordered to destroy. The laughing phase had ended, and the realization phase was taking hold, preparing the way for the final, cathartic collapse of the old Japanese identity. Under the gaze of the blue-eyed puppets and the promise of the white sugar cube, the civilian heart was being rebuilt from the ashes of its own misconceptions. The emotional dam did not merely leak, it burst with a violence that shook the collective frame of the gathered thousands. As the performance reached its crescendo, the silence in the village square was replaced by a sound that the occupation authorities had not fully anticipated, the sound of a nation weeping. It began as a low, rhythmic keening from the elderly women in the back, those who had stoically accepted the deaths of their sons as shattered jewels for the emperor. Now, watching a wooden puppet represent the same grief they had been ordered to internalize as pride, the facade of the warrior spirit collapsed. The crying was contagious, sweeping through the crowd like a gale. It was the sound of millions of people simultaneously realizing that their suffering had been unnecessary, that their enemies were human, and that the world they had inhabited was a construct of lies. This mass weeping was a documented phenomenon of the early occupation, a psychological purging that followed the initial period of laughter. The laughter had been the bridge, but the tears were the crossing. For the Japanese civilian, to cry in front of an American was the ultimate surrender of the ego. Yet they wept openly, their faces wet with the stinging salt of genuine catharsis. They cried for the years of hunger, for the cities burned to ash, and for the realization that the demons were the ones now offering them a future. The American GIs stood at the edges of the square, their helmets tucked under their arms, watching in a stunned, respectful silence. The kinetic energy of the victors had vanished, replaced by a quiet, somber observation of a people finally mourning themselves. The recurring symbol of the sugar cube took on its final, most potent meaning in this atmosphere of grief. As the weeping continued, the soldiers moved through the rows of people, no longer tossing the cubes as a game, but pressing them into the open palms of the sobbing adults. The contrast was absolute, the salt of the tears meeting the refined sweetness of the American sugar. It was a sensory metaphor for the transition of an entire civilization. The bitterness of the imperial past was being washed away by a literal and figurative sweetness. To receive sugar from the hand of the man who had defeated you, while you wept for the world you both lost, was the most profound democratic education possible. It was the moment the American puppet ceased to be a tool of propaganda and became a vessel for a shared humanity. The civilians were not crying because they were defeated. They were crying because they were finally allowed to feel. The strings of the state had been cut, and in the sudden, terrifying weight of their own freedom, the Japanese people found the strength to grieve for the lives they had almost forgotten how to live. This collective mourning was the true end of the war, a transformation of the heart that occurred in the presence of a wooden toy and a simple white cube of sugar. The performance concludes as the portable generators are powered down, the mechanical hum fading into a heavy, expectant stillness. The puppets are returned to their velvet-lined trunks, their wooden limbs folded with a care that borders on reverence. In the square, the Japanese civilians remain, their faces marked by the salt of their tears and the faint, lingering sweetness of the American sugar. They do not disperse with the hurried, fearful energy of the conquered. They linger in the ruins, speaking in low, hushed tones that are no longer dictated by the state. The white sugar cube, once a rare relic of a forgotten prosperity, has become the cornerstone of a new psychological architecture. It remains the physical proof that the world of the demon is a world of plenty, and that the path toward democracy is paved with the simple, undeniable kindness of a shared meal. The legacy of the American puppets lives on in the quiet reconstruction of the Japanese soul. These wooden actors, through their bumbling movements and slapstick humor, performed a surgery on the national spirit, removing the necrotic tissue of wartime indoctrination and replacing it with the vibrant, messy reality of human freedom. The civilians who laughed and then cried in the shadow of the occupation trucks were undergoing the first true lessons of a democratic life, the discovery that one can mock power, mourn loss, and accept mercy without losing one's dignity. The American puppet was not merely a tool of re-education. It was a mirror that allowed a broken people to see their own humanity reflected in the eyes of their former enemies. In the final assessment of history, the conquest of Japan was won not by the atomic flash or the naval blockade, but by the persistent, sugary grace of the peace that followed. The image of the child tasting his first sugar cube while watching a wooden doll dance remains the most potent symbol of the era. It represents the moment when a civilization chose to trade the bitterness of a holy war for the sweetness of a secular peace. The strings of the puppets have long since been cut, but the movement they initiated, a movement toward a world where abundance is shared and grief is acknowledged, continues to define the modern age. The story of the civilians who laughed until they wept is a poetic testament to a larger truth, that the ultimate victory of any ideology is found not in the destruction of the foe, but in the restoration of their capacity to feel, to hope, and to taste the sweetness of a world without war. The square is empty now, but the echo of that collective catharsis remains, a shimmering reminder that even in the darkest ash of defeat, the seeds of liberty are often planted with a joke and a single, perfect cube of white sugar.